Good afternoon. I'm happy to meet with you again. And because I love that metaphor, I love to meet you in the garden of art. So let's go and roam around the garden of art and let's see what kind of a tree we are going to enjoy today. We are right bumping into the huge, enormous tree. And what a splendid it is. What is a spectacle just to look at it. Look at these branches carrying the bloom and the fruit, and the birds are singing from those branches. What is this tree? It's ancient, like sequoia or ginkgo tree or old olive tree. I have to tell you, this is the tree of watercolor art. Watercolor art. Not for nothing, you are seeing on this first inviting page all this multiplicity of different things that we will eventually make sense of. So let's climb the tree. Let's check what is there. I'm honored today to be your tour guide, or if to use the metaphor of the birds singing and different songs that we are going to enjoy and put together, I'm going to be a DJ. So, what is watercolor after all? We are talking watercolor, watercolor. What is the watercolor? There is the Latin word aqua, which means water. And this word gave name to the French term for watercolor, which aquarelle, and Italian name for watercolor, which is aquarello, from the same word aqua. Now, people would take that water and thoroughly mix into it very finely ground pigment. They would use for that, as that pigment, different materials like minerals, dry plants, or some other organical substances, clays, a lot of things. And they would add to it a little bit of gum or honey, believe it or not. And it depends of how thick you are taking that substance, mix it, how thickly. It is transparent watercolor or so-called opaque watercolor, or other name of that French name, gouache. If, by the way, if to add to this mix a little bit of emulsion of egg yolk, then we are going to the old-fashioned tempera. At our art sessions, those who attend our open art sessions, we are using mostly transparent and opaque watercolor. So I thought it would be more than reasonable for us to explore it and actually to enjoy it. Let's go to the first occasion when old watercolor appeared first time. Guess when it was happening? It was happening in 18,000 BC. We are going to cave painting found in France by a very interesting circumstance. In 1940, 20th century, boys were walking their dog somewhere in the mountains near their village, and the dog got missed. So they went looking for them and eventually found their dog in the cave, decorated with these beautiful paintings. And so the start of the entrance of the ancient watercolor began. It began so popular for tourists that paintings I thought that it would a little bit too, yeah, I was a little bit too in a hurry. We'll get to the next slide in a few minutes. I just want to show you that slide, that picture, because eventually people who were taking care of that treasure, they understood that if they would not prevent it from getting peeled off, of getting just destroyed by the breathing of multiple crowds of people coming into it and looking at it, they'll be lost. So the center for cave painting, this is the image, was created over there in France in the place that I will try to pronounce Dordogne or something like that. And what they see there, their visitors, they see there the copy, the replica of the actual cave painting. I tried to pick up the image that more or less uh, related to the image that I'm showing you right there. So I believe that this is one of the pieces of the replica in the International Center of Cave Painting that reflects the actual cave painting. By the way, little detail. Once some sources believe that most times the artists for these cave paintings, again, I want to repeat it, 18,000 BC were women. See, we all are good, we all were good, and we all are going to be the best. Now, let's make a jump, a leap through millennia. It's not yet today, it is only like 3,500 ago, because here we see the frescoes executed with the same water-based paint, which can be seen as actual watercolor or opaque watercolor. Those who attend open art sessions know that I am absolutely in love with that particular image, because I believe that humankind have not yet created something that could stand there, compare with that image. So beautiful these blue ladies are. This is a fresco from the wall of the throne hall of the Knossos Palace on Crete. A few more images from the Knossos Palace, Hellenistic culture. We are encountering them. And another example of old use of watercolor, mostly opaque. If the frescoes could be considered sometimes transparent, like here, so then when you come to Egyptian papyruses, we mostly seeing the use of opaque watercolor. I've put together a number of them. Let me show you. This is the Queen Nefertiti playing the game of chess. That Nefertiti that we all know, one of the most beautiful ladies existing in the history of humankind, and few more. They are telling the stories about their traditions. They are having incorporated their wedding hieroglyphical depiction of the stories, which are presented in the visual images of them. One of the gods, another god with the animal head here, another scene, probably religious scene, with the eye and the god already in the animal shape, and another person is praying there. That one I picked up because it shows you what is the age of the papyruses, and their age is a little bit younger than Knossos frescoes. They are somewhat 1300 BC. something like that. This is, by the way, the fresco uh, from that from the same period of Hellenico-Egyptian culture. Now we are going to make a big jump in time. We are now in our time. Not it is the time that we live. It is the period from 1 to 3rd century of our time. And those beautiful portraits, really beautiful portraits, they are called Fayum portraits. They're faces of people painted in opaque watercolor on mostly wooden plates, wooden tables, small ones. And then some of them are covered in acoustic manner with wax. Some of them are left as is. And again, by sheer occasion, we have them in our museums and cave of treasures, so to speak. In 1987, in 1887, I'm sorry, in 1887, in near the village in somewhat Fayum oasis, one farmer was digging the ground, and that farmer found some strange pile of wooden little pieces, and they were all dirty and covered with ground, dirt, whatever. But to our fortune, this farmer was a very smart person, and eventually it was understood that these are the things which are worthy to sell. So one antique collector from Austria, Theodor Graf, bought a humongous amount of those tablets, and from him, next year and after next year, 1888, 1889, and a little bit later, 10 years later, the shows of those Fayum portraits run around the museums of the world, first in Europe, then in 93 in New York, and now the biggest, most respectable museums are proudly counting those portraits in their collection. These portraits were painted, as I described, in the technique of actual watercolor, opaque watercolor in most parts. They were used as memorials. Some of them were, as story says, were hung in the attics of people's houses. And they have their likeness. Just when I look at this face, I understand that it is not only a beautiful painting. Look at the colors, look at the combination of light and shadows and color combination, but you have clear feeling that the likeness of that depiction is very strong. There are faces that are just beautiful. There are faces as just melancholic young man is here. That little girl is also very moving. That portrait, by the way, that I am encircling for you, it is from the British Museum. When I looked at her, it just occurred to me that her face is very contemporary, that her eyes are so connected with the perception of the person, me, who lives today. And by the way, look how it is executed. All right, let's go further. What will be our next leap? What will be our next branch of the tree of watercolor? Another 3 centuries, about 3 centuries we are covering with our next jump. This is the year of 635, actually started from 635 with the foundation of the monastery of Lindisfarne. The story of so-called Lindisfarne Gospels starts. This is illuminated manuscript. And watercolor was used in those times for illuminating manuscripts. These are the works created by Irish monks. There are some illuminated manuscripts created by Ethiopian. These are the images of Ethiopian Bible. It feels to me that if the picture of that kind were created today, there would be so much of admiration of the artistry and the sense of importance and the composition and the color. And this one, of course, you could not avoid enjoying that ornament. That richness of that ornamentation is very characteristic for the illuminated manuscripts. Now, another thing I have to admit to, when I was choosing what image I would use to put as the last piece of that illuminated manuscript little presentation, I couldn't avoid choosing this one. It's called Scribe. See what this person is doing? That person is creating possibly that manuscript, the pages of which we are looking at, enjoying it. So through the whole century and a little bit later, the use of watercolor as a medium for illuminating manuscripts and handmade books was very common, just very relatively can be put, because what can be common about handmade manuscripts? It's a unique piece of art. So watercolor, though used as the almost technical medium, were used for creating art. Now let's go further. What we have on our next slide. Yeah. Now we are in 15th century in Germany. What you are looking at two absolutely outstandingly famous images created by no one but Albrecht Dürer. It is said about Albrecht Dürer that he was possibly one of the first self-conscious artists in European art. He was not only a painter, engraver, draftsman, scientist in his own right. He has created a lot of texts and scientific, almost scientific researches. He has created his famous Dürer font Antiqua. And when you look at it at some point, or I will show you at some point, you will see that it is constructed, not only made beautiful, constructed with tools and instruments. So Dürer was one of the first artists from that part of Europe who decided to go to Italy to see how was the early Renaissance working over there. And when he was in Italy, he created the image of that young hair. It's watercolor, sheer watercolor. Now it is part of the collection of Albertina in Vienna. Getting back to Nuremberg, Durer created that painting. It's also watercolor, also well known to anyone who is interested in visual art. It is called Great Piece of Turf because Dürer depicted here just the weeds, just the weeds. So you see that the beauty comes not to, but through the work of art. You may remember the idea that I tried to introduce and repeated it not once, that what makes art art? Of course, it is the love that artist puts into it work, and through this art embodied into the visual beauty of his or her creation, it is a message for you, for me, for everyone who is looking at it. When we are looking at these images, we see the watercolor as tool, as medium for technical use, is getting into making sheer visual fine art, the thing that we are calling fine art. So the change of understanding and perception of the medium of watercolor is pending. But before I will show you that change, I want to show you something else, which is very close to art. It is art. I don't know, you may remember in the very first presentation of art, we already had the chance to have a little look at some of those pictures. Those pictures, watercolors, painted in the old-fashioned way when watercolor, transparent watercolor, by the way. Here we are dealing with transparent watercolor. So watercolor is applied on the prepared piece of paper in layers, in multiple layers. Multiple, it is truly multiple, because all the shapes, all the perspective, all the details are created through the painstakingly patient work of the artist who created those images. These images are presenting the interior of one of the best world museums, Hermitage, in St. Petersburg, Russia, and they were created in 18th century, starting from the beginning of 18th century, like 1830 and further on. And here we see how Hermitage, when he was still Winter Palace, the name is held, but now it is not an imperial palace, but the palace of art. So it was looking from the river Neva, or with the sailboats on its waters. And there are some inner spaces of that palace presenting art. It was a museum, actually, when emperors, tsars of Russia were still occupying that place. And sometimes they were open for public. And you can see little figures over there. These are people who came to see the paintings, the visual art treasures collected in that Hermitage. Why I think it is so interesting for us to look at these images in particular, because though the images present the use of watercolor as a way to document the space, the interior, to present it to posterity as is, these images are stepping over that borderline that divides technical use of material and use of material that delivers us to art making. I personally see those images, though they perform their technical use perfectly well, it presents all the details, everything. to any single piece of the floor. And it is also art. Remember, when artist puts his heart, her heart into his or her work, love is delivered through his art. So let's go to the next step. Yeah. So this is the change. The change is Englishman called Joseph Mallard William Turner, the great Turner. When I was thinking about the presentation of watercolor, I thought that Turner would possibly give us a nice example of real watercolors. And I was not disappointed because I did know Turner's watercolors a little bit. We all know his oil paintings much better than watercolors. But when I turned my eyes onto his watercolors, I understood that Turner was born for that medium. And he is named as the person, as the artist, fine artist, who actually brought watercolor as the medium to the serious consideration as the medium creating serious art. Of course, before him, there were artists who would use watercolor, creating images more or less belonging to the realm of fine art. But more exciting than Turner made it, nobody was able to do it. Turner was considered as one of the most remarkable painters of his century. He was excessively traveled around the world and started doing it very soon because when he was 14, he entered the academy, which in some decades he became a full member of. At 15, he already showed his watercolor at one of the academy exhibitions. And at 16, he went to his first travel. He did travel around the world. He traveled to the Nice. He traveled everywhere around the Britain. And everywhere he was working nonstop. He was doing his sketches, his watercolors, his endless materials for his oil paintings. But his watercolors became and had been becoming more and more popular. And though he was admired as a very passionate and prolific painter, able of delicate and unique use of watercolor and paper as it was written. He was the first who did that kind of presentation of his perception. He's considered now as the father of Impressionism, Turner. Let me show you more of Turner, because I think the more we see Turner, the better to our health. Few more. Look carefully at each of these pictures. You can even see how the specifics of different pigment of watercolor paint work here. Those of you who use watercolor in your own exercise with painting know well that when you use ultramarine paint, loosen into a good number of water, when it dries, it gets you that very interesting texture, like a little grains of pigment is shown through the transparency of watercolor. And finally, I believe that that probably one of the best watercolors existing in the world of art and in the world of watercolor, definitely. So I could show you like 5 more, 10 more slides of Turner watercolors, but we have a lot of things yet to cover. So let's go to our next slide. Yeah. This is John Singer Sargent, the artist who lived in 19th century. He was born in 1856 and lived in the very first quarter of 20th century. He lived until 1924. We talked about him. Our last meeting was dedicated to his art in many hypostases of it. And one of the sides of his body of work, Sargent's, was the work in watercolor, because he's such a master. Sargent mastered watercolor, and he traveled the world as well. Venice again. Apparently, Venice presents so much of pleasure for watercolor painters, especially for watercolor painters for some reason, to depict the images of that, maybe because of the water of Venice, maybe because of the beauty of the water of Venice. However, it is not the last time when even in our presentation, we are seeing the images created by artists while observing the Venice. I'm going to jump back to the previous slide because I wanted to show you Turner's Venice. This is Sargent Venice. See, it looks this way. Let's see how it looks at Turner. Venice. I believe it is that one, or this one, possibly this one. So Venice and watercolor. There is the very natural combination of medium, perception, and the image of the world that we are getting inspired by. And the mastership of the master, and the multiple reflection from water to object, from object to water, details, lightness of the brush, excitement that is embedded here, as well as this very interesting watercolor piece. It is very complex. You would say that for watercolor, it is too serious, but watercolor is a very serious medium. Remember, by the time when Sargent works on this particular piece, somewhere the very end of 19th, the very beginning of 20th century, the watercolor counts already, what, 20,000 years? It is a very mature medium. It can do whatever you want to do with itself. Let's see what is next. Next is also Sargent. And though these images are presenting very serious matters, oxes and portraits, and this very famous piece from the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, Also, it can be used as an artistic joke because this piece, you may remember that because I had the pleasure of showing it to you already. This is the piece depicts the artist Monet. Claude Monet is painting, and another artist, John Singer Sargent, is painting Claude Monet while Claude Monet is painting. Very interesting and very beautiful and very light, like a light, good joke. All right, let's see what we have. So them, yeah, Paul Cézanne. Paul Cézanne. Paul Cézanne is considered as the father of contemporary art, though he was living from the middle of 19th century to the very beginning of 20th century. He was born in 1839 and lived and worked hardly. He worked very hard until the very beginning of 20th century. In his work, he did use watercolor for different reasons. One of the reasons was that he was preparing for his oil paintings. And I put side by side the watercolor self-portrait and the oil self-portrait. So you see how that connection between etude and finished project is obvious. How obvious is this connection? One more example of that. This one, etude of his garden in watercolor and oil painting of his garden, and etude for his famous card players. Now, Paul Cézanne, being a young man and being born in a wealthy family, his father was a wealthy man. So Paul Cézanne started studying the law. He had to become a lawyer. And after a couple of years of studying the law, he dropped it altogether, being, by the way, supported by his friend Émile Zola, with great disappointment of his father. However, Cézanne, with all the concentration that you can see in his art, and we will talk about it a little bit later, he started his way in art. And that was another crucial change that was to happen through his art. He went to Paris for a few years. He met there a few impressionists. He was impressed by impressionism. And then he stepped further to stronger, more concentrated observation of the world around him, of the objects he was perceived. And he created a special way of applying paint on the canvas. In our case, it will be the paper. Geometrically defined the brush stroke that should go to the certain place and to create the certain shape. That one is a perfect example of what we are talking now. You can see every single brush of strokes, and every single brush of strokes sits in its own place. And it creates that image that it creates. This landscape is another perfect example. Art of Cézanne and his work as an artist and as a thinker through the art. He influenced through his art many other artists who came with him and a little bit later than him. everyone who comes to your mind, Matisse, Picasso, Kandinsky, Duchamp, um, Malevich, everyone took that um, took that way of observing the world around him. What observers, professional observers, say about Cézanne? He was the one who established relationship between the observed world and the artist, and introduced into this relationship the third party, which is the art of work that this artist is creating, which, by the way, opens the way to abstraction. Can you believe that not only cubists, obviously, can find their roots in Cézanne's work, but abstractionists as well. All right, let's see what we have here. Two pictures came to us through the other part of the world. The other part of the world is Russia of 19th century. The artist who didn't work for a long time. He lived only 35 years. His name is Borisov Musatov. He exhibited his art around the world in Europe very actively. He was in Paris studying and making connections with Impressionists, and he was showing his art in their salons, and he showed his art in Germany, and of course he showed his art in Russia as well. I just wanted us to see, as it was said about Turner at one point, I wanted to repeat that definition, delicacy and uniqueness of dealing with watercolor and paper. The portrait of his future wife and the depiction of the terrace or porch of the house that they lived. Unfortunately, only two pieces of his watercolor I can show you, but we have plenty of things to look at yet. So let's go and see what's next. Yeah. The next is another great artist that came to the world from Russia. His name is Kuzma Petrov Vodkin. In the very beginning, he studied the painting of icons, of Russian icons. Those of us who know the specific space, the specific presentation existing in Russian icons can immediately recognize that approach. Having the sheer beauty of those watercolors, because these are watercolors. Though further, a little bit later, I'm going to show you two oil paintings of Petrov, actually not two, but possibly more, because I wanted to point out at some special reason of showing it to you. Petrov Vodkin was studying then academical classical way of creating visual arts. His drawings are perfect. His students' studies are just as perfect as they can possibly be. He was a perfect drawer, perfect draftsman. And though he, from 1918, he lived from 1878 to 1939, and from the beginning of 20th century, from 1918 through 30s, 33, he was a professor of Russian Academy of Art in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. But however, Petrov Vodkin was participating in so many exhibitions around the world. You cannot find the city, the big city or smaller city in Europe and America that the works of created by Petrov Vodkin were not presented. Whatever city you name, it was there. Not to mention that all the Venice biennales that were held while the artist was alive and after his death. His work were in attendance on those Venice biennales. How he worked? Of course, he is a great painter and great watercolor painter because it is a watercolor. It presents some story of old Russian culture, and this one, man plowing, handling the horse. I want to show you how this artist, Kuzma Petrov Vodkin, was using watercolor not only for creating the piece of fine art as beautiful as it is, like here as well, but also for preparing for a major oil paint. Look at this etude. See? The girls at the river Volga. Look at this oil painting. Can you see some kind of resemblance? And we, of course, appreciate that I wouldn't call it etude. It is independent piece of art, but there is some strong relation between these images. This one, two girls somewhere at the river maybe, and the group of young ladies with the child over there. It's not all about Petrov Vodkin because I wanted to show you something else of his art. This is another etude. I wanted to step back because I wanted to mention one more thing about Petrov Vodkin's art. He's created his well-known spherical perspective. It is shown a little bit in this painting, a little bit in this painting, and in this painting. And he combined here, not combined, but he was using the treatment of space in Russian icon. These are the positions of the heads that that we used to see on the icons, and the Renaissance building of space. In 2009, Time magazine, by the way, placed on its cover one of the details of his paintings, Madonna, that by the construction was very similar to that watercolor, but it was in oil. That artist created a lot of things for the theater. These are stage design for Boris Godunov opera, and another stage design for Boris Godunov opera. Why I'm showing it to you? Because you see that watercolor serves here not only as the easy handled and easy, very flexible, very friendly material for creating these kinds of complex pictures. This is, by the way, the etude for the face painting, for the not only for the costume, but also for creating the facial image of the character for the actor who would be singing Boris Godunov's aria. These pictures are oil paintings. I mentioned that I brought it to be included into that particular display because I wanted you to see how artist saw himself and how he treated the space. This is his younger depiction of himself, though you can see the traces of the future spherical perspective creator. And this is his self-portrait made in later days. And by the way, looking at it, you understand that yes, he knew how to draw, how to build the space, how to use the color, but it is shown in all of his watercolors that we just observed. And now we are going to treat yourself with a very special treat. Yeah. Ballet Russe in France in the beginning of 20th century, when they were brought by Diaghilev, and European culture was embracing this new beauty of their mainly not well-known culture. An artist, leading stage designer of the collective that Diaghilev brought and put together for his Russian seasons in Paris, was Leon Bakst. Leon Bakst. It is an adopted name of Lev Rosenberg. Born in Russia, he moved to France and mainly lived there to the end of his life. He moved to France in 1910, and he lived until 1924. When we are trying to bring to our recollection the images related to Russian ballet Russe in France in those times, what images come to our mind? Of course, there are photographs, and they do present their stages, their dancers, there are other people who were contributing to it. But these images created by Leon Bakst for Firebird, in this case, for the dance of the genius of Nijinsky in this case, and this costume, I put as the first image presenting the art of Leon Bakst because it says it all. A program for one of the performances of Russian ballets in Paris. Yes, I believe that Leon Bakst is being very recognizable and being very, very responsive to the preference of the time. Findesical loved exotics, modern art loved all those curved lines and exotic colors and all these things. But you know what? Not only being so receptive and reflective of the fashion of the trend of time, and by the way, being a very good student of the art schools he graduated from. Look at this figure presentation, and look at this figure presentation. Leon Bakst has created his name through that body of work, I think. for all good reasons. When I think about art of Nijinsky, and we more or less know this name, I think about the etude created by Leon Bakst for his costume for the afternoon fun ballet. Here, in that painting, in watercolor, of course, by the way, because it is, again, the medium that they all were using for theater. It was very convenient. The paint is very flexible and friendly. It says not only about the ballet, it says about dance. It says about dance, how genius was the movement of that dancer. Nothing is better giving me as a viewer this message of beauty, of movement, of the material substance. And this is another costume for Nijinsky, by the way, for the other ballet. Now we see the set designs. The pictures are created by Bakst for the set designs. They are quite different from those that created by Boris Vodkin. Let me jump back a few pages so we can compare that. Yeah. It's also created for the opera Boris Godunov. And look what Bakst is doing. Here we are. See the difference? I'm comparing, not aiming at choosing a better presentation. I'm comparing, aiming at showing you how outstandingly beautiful is art of watercolor in the hands of different artists. It is my aim. Look at this one. And now we have the treasure here. Every picture, I will keep that slide for some time so you can enjoy it, truly, truly enjoy it. Because here we have the set design for Scheherazade, and here we have the set design of Sleeping Beauty. See the difference? See the image that art is showing to us. Without even touching the dance, you already feel the aura of it. How it is done? By the art of a good artist. Remember, when you put your heart into your art, your love goes to the person who receives the message. All right, next. Next is again Bakst. I know that it is overwhelming, but believe me, if I could put here all that I've found and love so much, we would never finish our conversation today. So just enjoy it. Just enjoy what is possible to enjoy. The Scheherazade, the depiction of costumes, the dance presented through the costume, through the picture. You see, when the artist creates this kind of a project, it is a project, not only the painting. He has to put here a lot of thoughts and instructions, as you can see. This something about Sparta, because Bakst was working not only for Diaghilev company, but also for other companies and theaters very intensely. He was busy working, I believe. And now comes another famous name, which we cannot avoid when we are thinking and talking and trying to observe the way how art goes and develops itself and presents us to us, people, humankind. Vasily Kandinsky. This is his self-portrait. Made in watercolor. Ladies and gentlemen, watercolor is a very powerful medium. And it is said that this is his very first abstract composition. A lot of things Vasily Kandinsky has done. By the way, he started as a lawyer. He studied law and economics and started even teaching. He had to turn down his professorship when he was about 30. And then he went to Munich and started study art. I don't know what's happening with those artists. You're gonna meet another genius a little bit later in that presentation who also started from studying law. I don't know what is the connection between thinking in terms of law and thinking in terms of visual art. I personally know one very fine lady who is a lawyer and who is putting her hands into art making as well. So probably it is a trend. So let's get back to Vasily. He worked a lot. He, with his fellow artists in Germany, founded the group and the journal, a magazine, Blue Rider. One of his paintings, by the way, gave birth to the title and to the image. One of his paintings, unfortunately for us, it is not a watercolor, and trying to to be persistent in my pursuit, I didn't put it into that presentation. It was an oil. Blue Rider was his painting. And then he started creating abstract paintings. He was not an abstractionist in the very beginning, but having the set of mind, the structure of mind that was Vasily Kandinsky's structure of mind, he became a he created a number of theories. So he became a theoreticist. And on the top of it, he belonged to the rare group of people whom we call synesthesists. What it means that Vasily Kandinsky could hear the sound of the color, as Stravinsky, as Stravinsky, by the way, as well. As Scriabin could see the color of his music. So Kandinsky wrote his art theories about shapes and lines and planes and everything. For example, let me show you one piece here, this one, with the circles. He had considered the special meaning of the circle as shape, and you can see the circles in his paintings. And he paints loose hand. Can you see it? And can you see how watercolor is washed freely around more strictly defined elements? However, whatever successful work he and his friends in Germany created until 1914. When the war started, he went back to his homeland, to Russia, and he stayed here until 1922. He worked very hard trying to collaborate with the authorities of the Soviet Russia, together with all good names that you can find there. Rodchenko, Malevich, Chagall, Tatlin, Petrov-Vodkin, they all tried to construct, to create the programming and the structure that would allow to proffer art to the people freed from their oppression. um, he studied, he taught, he was taking some important positions in the structure of those educational institutions. And when one of those institutions was open in 1922, by the end of the same year, Kandinsky left for Germany and never came back. And we, knowing what was happening over there in Soviet Russia and Soviet Union later in years, we could think that probably the fortune knew the fate of Kandinsky knew its ways and brought him from the danger to the world where he continued creating his art, where he continued thinking about theories in art, and continued teaching. He became one of the professors of the famous Weimar Bauhaus Art and Design School and stayed there until 33, I believe, when the Bauhaus was closed. And then he moved to France, where he stayed until the end of his life in 1944. And intensively and extensively, he created, painted, wrote his texts and showed, and he was very popular. He sold his pieces left, right, and everywhere. And now you can find his art in any museum in the world. The collection of his writings, of his texts, was published. The latest publication, as I learned about, was in 1982. He's still read, considered as one of the most important thinkers in art of our time, Kandinsky and his watercolors. And more of Kandinsky, you see, I just wanted to give you a chance to appreciate his work, because not only it is all very smart and thoughtful and balanced and well composed, and boom, that is unexpected composition by Kandinsky, because we know him with more detailed, elaborated compositions. And this one you may notice in our inviting page. Yes, though he was not the very first one who tried his hands and mind on abstraction, but it is popular thought that Vasily Kandinsky is the father of abstractionism. And it is well presented in many media, including watercolor paintings, with specifics of that media. Not only he uses it with the knowledge of how to work it out, how exactly as many others did. Turner, for example. All right, next we will have to meet somewhere else. Dear art explorers, we have to make a stop here until the broadcasting of the second part of the Art Time and Again presentation. I'm very pleased that we have enjoyed ourselves and that we experienced that pleasure, that joy of visual happiness owing to the beauty of so many things. owing to the beauty of cave paintings, to the illuminated manuscripts of medieval time, owing to the outstanding delicacy and passion of Joseph Turner artwork, to the bliss of Vasily Kandinsky inventiveness as a painter, as a theory thinker, as an educator, as world phenomenon in art. When we meet next time, the celebration of watercolor continues with many beautiful things, with powerful serenity and harmony of Matisse paintings, with special simplicity, bold simplicity of watercolors of the grand Henry Moore, of unexpected deep complexity of the people's painter Andrew Waith, and with the masterful joy of fashion illustration, and with much, much more. Thank you very much. Looking forward to meet you again.